Hello and a warm welcome to all of you. You are listening now to the second online panel of the conference dealing with violence, resolving conflicts in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. This is a conference organized by the Center of Atlantic and Global Studies at Leibniz University of Hanover and hosted by the Volkswagen Stiftung. There will be as well a kind of face-to-face meeting in the frame of this conference. This will be in July, from July 25 to July 27 this year. So we are now in an innovative first online phase, which prepares presentations and videos for this conference as well. My name is Matthias Bös. I'm a sociologist from the Institute of Sociology at the Leibniz University here in Hanover. The title of the panel is The Many Facets of Violence, Highlights from Ongoing Research from Nigeria, South Africa, Cameroon, and Colombia. And it already hints to the fact that there are many forms and ways of violence when we look in conflict or post-conflict situations in Africa and Latin America. And from a sociological perspective, I think the topic of today is intriguing because it talks about violence and, at least as I see it, in relation to citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen, and how do you make political claims or other claims in a certain situation? And the tension there was always a tension between conflict and violence, and citizenship was always reacted in these different contexts, be it on a local, national, regional, or global level. Of course, the relation between violence and citizenship is always contested, and at this panel, we will look on 4 different arenas where we see these renegotiations of different social formations of violence and how they are related to citizenship. We start with some consideration on violence against women and faith-based organization who want to kind of help these women, and there are different kinds of acts of citizenship involved. On the one hand, there is an act of citizenship by the women, kind of go to these different institutions, and on the other hand, there is of course an act of citizenship by the different organizations in trying to help these women in these difficult situations. The second presentation is, at least from sociological point of view, a similar constellation. Here we have the topic of sexual violence against men and the response of humanitarian organizations to it. And in both cases, we see how important it is to restore citizenship in certain situations, in a sense that you can restore recognition and the dignity of a person, of an institution in certain situation in the presence of violence. We then turn to a slightly different topic, is the formation of militias in rural areas, and see here how violence is socially organized, and this kind of violence can be as well seen as a kind of act of citizenship or act of claims making against, for example, other military or political forces. And at the last presentation will be on one of the most important forms of the social organization of the relation between citizenship and violence. This is, of course, the law. And here the law is seen as a kind of set of different regulations in conflict situations where they legitimize or delegitimize different forms of structural violence, and in this case, the reproductive health and rights of women. And here we see the difficult interplay between the local, national, regional, and international level of legal regulations. So you see, we have kind of different interesting perspectives on that, and we will always talk about the relation of violence with social processes and conflicts, and the different inclusive and exclusive processes which are related to that. And we will do it in the spirit of the whole conference. This is, we have the aim to bring together, on the one hand, practitioners and scholars in the field, and of course, these from both sides of the Atlantic, from the very country, all the very countries they came from, in order to explore and discuss the similarities and differences in the social formation of violence in conflict situations. A few words on the choreography of the session. We will start with the presentations. We will do them en bloc. This means 4 presentations. Each presentation will be about 15 minutes. In order to keep the 15 minutes, the presenters see always a little clock, and they can kind of see exactly how much time they're left over, and they surely will finish in time. After that, we have time that you can pose your questions. In order to do that, you should enroll into or register in the chat, where you can kind of type in your name, and then you are able to pose your questions, and I will see it here on a slide, and we can kind of ask them to the presenters. So this is the introduction, and we now move forward to the first presentation. The first presentation is done by Fungai Shirongoma. Fungai is from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She earned a PhD in religious studies from the University of Cape Town, and she holds as well a Master in Religious Studies and a BA in Religious Studies from the University of Zimbabwe. Her research interest is in general, of course, on religion, but as well religion and gender and violence against women in religious traditions, for example, but she also works on religion and development and the phenomenology of religion. She published on Pentecostalism, and of course on different aspects of violence against women as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to her. The title of her presentation is Faith-Based Intervention in Addressing Violence Against Women in South Africa. Fungai, feel free to start.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthias. So my presentation basically is looking at how we can address the problem of violence against women from a religious perspective. So by way of background, I saw rife in South Africa, Cape Town. It's a social reality in South Africa, Cape Town, and various women organizations in South Africa estimate that 1 in every 3 women is a victim of rape, while other statistics states that 1 in every 6 women is in an abusive domestic relationship, and other statistics say 2 in every 5 women are beaten by their partners, and 1 in every 15 women is murdered by her partner. Although there are some debates around the statistics, these statistics generally reflect the intensity of violence against women in South Africa. So it is this intensity and extent of violence against women that's resulted in the country being named World Rape Capital, basically by media and humanitarian organizations. So now, how have the South African government responded to this problem of violence against women? So in response to the problem of violence against women, the South Africa has established the Prevention of Violence Act 113 of 1993. There is also the Domestic Violence Act 116 of 1998. There are also Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act 32 of 2007. Apart from these laws, there's a National Council Against Gender-Based Violence that also monitors and addresses violence against women. And it also established a 365-day of activism for no violence against women and children campaign. But despite all those policies, campaigns, and councils in place, the situation of violence against women remain unchanged. So now it is against this background that my study looks at the religious responses to violence against women. In this study, I basically say it is imperative to also consider religious-based interventions when addressing violence against women. So my focus is not on religion in general, but faith-based organizations. These look more or less like non-governmental organizations, but the only difference from their secular counterparts is they are motivated by religion in their operations. So I conducted my study through 3 organizations in South Africa. And basically those organizations, they offer education and advocacy around issues of violence against women. Then the other organizations offer shelter for abused women and children, and they offer counseling to abused women. So now I'm going to move to the methodology. So in terms of methodology, I collected my data over a period of 2 years. I started in 2017 to 2020, and around this time, I was mainly focusing on participant observation. So I visited those shelters and that other organization that is involved in advocacy, and I was observing the activities of the beneficiaries and the workers as they were taking part in their activities. Then around April 2018 to September 2018, I conducted some interviews with the founders of the organizations, the beneficiaries, and the workers. And in 2020, I had follow-up interviews with some of the beneficiaries. Now I'll move on to the 3 case studies that I focused on. The first case study is Ihata Shelter for Abused Women. This is a Muslim shelter that is based in Heidelberg, Cape Town. So basically this shelter addresses the problem of violence, and it helps women who are affected by violence. So it helps women to recover from experiences of abuse through various therapy programs. The organization has a goal of promoting independence and self-respect in women. This organization states that it's basically motivated by values of love, respect, compassion, and dignity. I'll move on to the second case study. Or before I can move to the second case study, these are some of the key activities that are offered at Ihata Shelter. Like I've mentioned, that they offer therapy programs. They've got some form of group therapy program that they offer. They also offer individual counseling to women affected by abuse. They've garden therapy and yoga therapy. Other services that they offer include skills training. So like I've mentioned earlier, that they try to promote self-independence in women. They teach them weaving, beading, and sewing for self-sustenance and economic independence. And another key service at this shelter is they offer religious services through prayers and Bible study sessions. Although Ihata Shelter for Abused Women is Muslim shelter for abused women, it is also open to women from other religions, and pastors are also welcome to come and teach women about religion and help them recover through the experiences of abuse. Then the second case study, more or less like Ihata Shelter, it also offers shelter and support to abused women, but quite different from the first one. Is this organization is a Christian shelter, and it is motivated by Christian values in its operation. So as this mission statement, it says that as an expression of God's love, we seek to provide shelter, support for pregnant and abused homeless women with children, through a holistic self-empowerment program that develops social, personal, creative, and vocational skills within a framework of Christian values and discipline and a culture of mutual learning, accountability, and respect for the unique value of every human being. Okay, now in terms of the services, it's more or less like IHATA shelter, but another difference is at St. Anne's Home, they offer vocational training skills and short courses such as home-based care and baking. This is also to help the women to be self-independent, like economically. They also assist in computer literacy training and job searching. They also have the same skills in weaving, beading, sewing, painting, and candle making. And the purpose of all those skills training is to help women to be self-sustenance. Then for those women who are abused and who have cases that are in court, they assist with protection orders and they escort to court hearings. And they also have the religious aspect where they offer religious-based interventions in terms of prayers and Bible study sessions. Then I'll move to the third case study. This is a little bit different from the first two. This one is called South Africa Faith and Family Institute. This one brings people from different faiths together to address the challenge of violence against women. So it basically brings people from Islam, Christianity, African traditional religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Baha'i faith. So the primary goal of this organization is to mobilize faith leaders and faith communities to address violence against women. And their main ways of teaching about violence against women is through education and advocacy. So SAFI basically sensitizes women about people about violence against women through workshops. And in these workshops, they use religious-based resources. For example, if they go to a Muslim community, they take resources from the Quran to teach about violence against women. And if they're in a Christian community, they also use the Bible to teach about violence against women. And if they're in an African traditional religious community, the appropriate resources within the religions from the myths and the rituals that are affirming to women to address violence against women. Then they also have a religious leaders forum on gender-based violence. And this forum, religious leaders from different communities and different religions, they come together and discuss how they are addressing violence from their different perspectives. And the facilitators from South Africa Faith and South African Faith and South African Faith and Family Institute help them to deal with those issues. Then they also have conferences, pilgrimages, and campaigns in dealing with violence against women. Then now this form of an analysis to my work. So in terms of analysis, it is imperative to consider religion when solving issues of violence against women in a society where religion determines gender power relations. For example, in South Africa, religion determines gender power relations. So it is therefore imperative to consider religion when addressing these issues. I also found out that in my study that religious leaders have the potential to mobilize religious communities in addressing violence against women. Then faith-based organization in terms of the two shelters, they've got the potential to provide support to abused women and empower them. Therefore, faith is an important mechanism for religious women recovering from experiences of abuse. Then by way of conclusion, the work of FBOs that I studied reflected the continued presence of religion in the public sphere and its role in addressing social problems such as violence against women. Although I do not dismiss laws that are in place, I argue that laws alone are not an effective strategy in a society where religion determines gender power relations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Fungai. This was excellent time-wise. I mean, you have 4 minutes left. That's great. So we have little bit more time for discussion. So we now move on to our second speaker of the panel. It's Catherine Akurut from Nelson Mandela University at Port Elizabeth, South Africa. She has a PhD in conflict management from the same university, where she graduated as well as a Magister of Philosophy. And she has a Bachelor of Arts History, a Bachelor of Arts in History as a major, and her minor was in German, which is of course intriguing, and it was from Makerere University in Uganda. Her research interests are, of course, conflict management, especially when it comes to different forms of sexual humiliation, but she is as well a practitioner in different fields where she worked on that, and she published as well on the topic, which she is going to talk about now. And the title of the talk is Policy Paths for Addressing Conflict-Related Sexual Violence Against Men, the Action Needed. Catherine, feel free to start.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for accepting me to present here today. My study was on the recognition and response to conflict-related sexual violence against men. And I was looking at specifically the humanitarian response. But for this symposium, I'll be concentrating on the policies that will lead to addressing conflict-related sexual violence against men. And I'm looking at the action that ought to be covered in this regard. So my background, the issue has mostly been ignored and neglected for several years until about 2013. And this is because there's been so much discussions in regards to men, and so many men were coming up and saying we've been sexually violated, but there's not been usually any response because the humanitarian organizations were not sure on what to do. And also the way to alleviate the suffering, how to do so without necessarily compromising on the existing mandates against responding to sexual violence against women has also been a challenge. So these uncertainties have made finding ways to help men who have been sexually victimized, providing them with assistance has been a challenge because of these debates. And in my research, I did reveal that in humanitarian organizations, their response has an issue in their response is effective in increasing the disclosure of men who have experienced sexual victimization, but this is within conflict zones. So service providers have the potential to have this impact so that men are able to access these services should they be existing. But how to do so should be considered in an appropriate responsive way. So the actions that are needed, of course, we need to listen to men because in our societies, men are considered as strong. So they are not looked at people who are not looked at individuals who can experience sexual violence. So if we listen to them and learn from them, then there will be an increase in their in whatever they experience during this conflict whilst conflict is going on. And this means that the first responders need to have a particular mandate on how to clearly define what services are to be offered to them. And then another action that is needed is to intentionally implement services for men that are suited for men, and in doing so, we'll be able to establish the best strategies on how to respond to men. And one of these ways is to have separate entry points which are needed, as opposed to, you know, having an entry point where both women and men converge in order to seek services. There's also a need for awareness as far as sexual victimization against men is concerned. And this is a discourse that the humanitarian community has attempted to pick up in the past 5 years. And addressing the knowledge, the lack of knowledge amongst both the men who experience this sexual violence, as well as the service providers who offer these services, is still limited. So there's a severe lack of knowledge in this regard. Why is it important to look at men? There are several reasons for that, but for one, the United Nations sexual violence resolutions has picked it up. And one of the first time it was mentioned that men do experience sexual violence was in 2013, where resolution 2106 mentioned that, or revealed that men experience sexual violence within conflict zones. But between 2013 and 2019, there's not been much action, which is why I also quoted resolution 2467, where that mention of 2013 was expanded on, and the resolution was calling for humanitarian organizations to come up with ways, or to consider looking at considering strategies on how to assist men who have been sexually violated in conflict zones. So in the resolution 2106, this would be considered as the first time that conflict-related sexual violence against men had been recognized in an organization such as the United Nations. Why is it important still? This is to demonstrate that it is not impossible to provide services to men who have been victimized alongside women, although there are some debates on how much of these services can be imputed to the men, and if we can use the same services that have been offered to women, can the same services be offered to men? So this is where the debates are at the moment. If we are to offer services, can we do so? Can humanitarian organizations do so at the same time? And then also it is important because there's been credible progress as far as identifying the forms of sexual violence against men, which are much different from how women experience sexual violence. But it is particularly within a conflict zone. Say, for example, some of the forms of conflict-related sexual violence against men include rape, but not in the way that women are raped. Men are raped, so for example, when an object is used to rape, and this is through anal rape, or another form of rape could be mouth penetration. I also categorized the forms of sexual violence against men in 3 categories, that is rape, genital torture, and sexual humiliation. So another form of sexual violence against men within the conflict zone could be penile amputation or forced circumcision, or where in some conflicts men are forced to engage in sexual intercourse with animals. And then for sexual humiliation, I'll mention fellatio, and sexual violence where men are forced to sexually violate corpses, and also where they're forced to watch, as say, for example, their family members are being raped, or they are forced to watch where family members are forced to have intercourse amongst each other. So those are some of the conflict-related forms of sexual violence against men that have been identified, and at the core of having solutions in how to alleviate the suffering amongst the men who have experienced these violences. So the issues involved at the moment is most of the needs of the men who have been victims of sexual violence are not fully understood. There's also a lack of clarity as far as what kind of response should be given to them. And of course, the disclosure is a little bit reluctant amongst men because of how society views men in not all societies, but most of the society, men are viewed as individuals who are strong and they cannot, experience some of these things. Then there is limited understanding on how sexual violence particularly affects men, and especially if they experience it. And of course, the pervasive view that sexual violence solely occurs amongst women, and the knowledge to effectively intervene and have strategies that are specifically tailored to men. So in regards to my title, which is about the policy I'm looking at, policies should target specifically 4 themes that I've mentioned here, and that is the mandate of the first responders, and also looking at entry points, then the avenues of collaboration and referrals, and then increased awareness. So I'll first mention a few points with regards to the mandate of first responders. So for example, there will be first responders within when conflict has broken out and there's a breakaway for humanitarian organizations to respond to the refugees that are coming in. Usually the first responders, say for example, if it's a doctor, it will be quite tedious if a doctor does not know or is not aware that sometimes victims of sexual violence will not express themselves, or the violence that has occurred to them will not be visible to the person that is receiving them. So the first responders, say for example, doctors, need to be aware of certain kinds of mandates and the nitty-gritties when receiving the survivors or victims from a conflict zone. Then in my specification of a separation of entry points, this is in regards to most of the entry points are women-based. Say for example, if they are it's a medical response, these medical responses are normally within the maternity wards, and men are not quick or keen to enter a maternity ward and talk about their experiences. So there will be a need to separate entry points for men and then separate from those that are existing for women. And in regards to avenues for collaborations, sometimes the first responders would like to help these men that have approached them in regards to sexual violence, but they're not able to because they're not aware of any organizations that are offering services to men, or they are not aware of any referral organization. So an awareness and increased knowledge in that regard would be assisting in the disclosure amongst men. And then also the increase of awareness as far as sexual violence is concerned within a particular community. Some of the examples that came up with my research is having leaders that are communicative as far as offering awareness that men too experience certain kinds of sexual victimization or violence in itself within a conflict zone. And also the men have an initial point to approach in case they're not able to go to the first responders. They can go to these trailblazers, or also these trailblazers can use storytelling, like say, for example, here I'll cite Men of Hope in Uganda. It is made up of sexual victim male survivors who offer themselves to tell stories or to tell their own stories in regards to sexual victimization. And this has helped other men, to have the confidence to seek help for the violence that has occurred to them. So in conclusion, there will be more research needed in exploiting some of the means that I've mentioned above. And that in itself also means that different countries will have different ways to implement these suggestions that came out of the research. And then also there is more need for research for the services that are offered to men and what they think of those services. In doing so, humanitarian organizations and service providers in general will be able to establish what are the best strategies in responding to men who have been sexually victimized. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for this interesting talk. And now we have the chance to move on to the next presentation. The presentation is by Angela Navarrete Cruz from the University of Hohenheim. At this very university, she earned a doctor in agricultural sciences. She is earned as well an MA and Master in Political Studies at the National University of Colombia at Bogota. And there she studied as well, or made a program as a sociologist at the same university. Her research interests are quite broad and related to the agrarian context, of course, all kinds of interstate conflicts, different kind of violence, and different ways of peace building in these rural areas, especially if they are linked to sustainable agriculture. She had a lot of work experience in different projects where she worked on the ground, but did as well a lot of research on these different topics. So I will hand on the word to Angela. Feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Today I will talk about civilian militias. My presentation is entitled Why Peasants Fight Rebels, the case of the peasant militias against the FARC-EP in southern Tolima, Colombia. So what is happening? Recent literature is unveiling the manifold responses civilians are having in interstate conflicts and in general in violent conflicts. And one of the responses may be collaboration with armed actors or their foes, act pacifically to challenge the presence of armed actors. And in this case, what the group of civilians intends to is to make the violent actor to refrain from using violence against civilians. And we also have, unfortunately, violent contention from civilians. And one of the most radical forms of violent contention is the formation of militia groups. And by militias, I refer to local armed groups that are formed by civilians and promote a reactionary agenda against insurgents. So they mainly aim at protecting property and providing security. And the presence of militias in intrastate conflict has been quite important. It has been reported in 2/3 of violent conflicts since 1989, and they can be either community initiated or military initiated. There are two types of militias. This is important because we have community militias that refer to part-time militias based on local territorial communities, and the civilians in these kinds of militias can continue with their everyday lives with a certain normality. And these militias usually develop tactical functions, defensive functions, instead of attacks. And we also have professionalized militias, which demand full commitment of the rank and file. And then the structure of incentives is more economic. They have payments, they have rent extraction, and they can also develop strategic functions. They usually attack the enemy, in this case, rebels. So militias are considered highly effective in unbalanced military stalemates to favor the incumbent government. And this is shown by several cases, for instance, the Rondas Campesinas in the Peruvian conflict against Sendero Luminoso, or the Mozambican War and the Naparama group. However, in conflict with participation of militias, we have several disadvantages. For instance, civilian targeting from rebels, of course, is going to increase because civilians are now armed. They can turn violent against non-combatants or to a government that supported their formation in the first place. They can spark new cycles of violence, and the mobilization of militias can be difficult, even in the cases when the government engages in peace talks with rebels. Then we have problems for the mobilizing militias. However, we don't know factors accounting for the process of militia formation, especially in the case of military-initiated and community-based militias. This is important because we cannot assume a linear process from a command of the army to the formation of civilian militias, simply because civilians and communities can organize and refuse to participate in this kind of violence. So my research wanted to address why is civilian contention from territorial communities in the form of part-time and military-initiated militias possible. And subsidiary questions are, why does the army succeed in promoting community militias if they can still refuse the participation in this kind of violent contention? And also, under which circumstances peasants react violently against insurgent groups that recognize them as their constituents? And this is important in view of the study area. I conducted data collection in the department of Tolima in Colombia, and specifically in southern Tolima. This area is usually considered as a stronghold of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, the FARC-EP, because actually this group was formed in 1964 in the rural area of Planas, and this was a communist group with a strong agrarian program based on the rallying cry, land for the till. However, we have two cases of peasant-based militias, the cases of Ataco, Chaparral, and Rio Blanco, where the militias acted like a network. And then we have another case here from the community Paes of Gaitania. This is an ethnic community. However, the socioeconomic structure in both areas is quite similar. We are talking about smallholder communities. So I was intrigued to know why peasants were fighting against this group that had this strong agrarian program. And for data collection, I implemented a qualitative approach by conducting in-depth interviews, group interviews, and a timeline exercise with farmers, community leaders, public servants, and former FARC-EP members. And also for triangulation, due to a wide time frame I'm considering, from 1950 to 2000, I also rely on several secondary sources. So regarding the first case, Ataco, Rio Blanco, and Chaparral, what I found is that initially, and this is the reason why I started the research from the 1950s, we had in this period a conservative government that was persecuting other political ideologies, especially liberals, but later on communists, and they used the army, but also civilian squads against these political ideologies, and they were very violent against them. So what the liberals and communists did, they allied and they had a camp in the municipality of Rio Blanco in southern Tolima. However, conflicts started between these two groups, I mean the liberals and the communists, because of doctrine issues. The communist peasants defended the collectivization of the land and wanted a revolution. And actually, in this case, we had mainly landless peasants, while in the case of the liberals, they were defending private property because most of the peasants engaged in this group were already owning the farms. And they wanted to be included actually in the nation-state project. So the liberal guerrillas demobilized between 1953 and 1954 and became the counterinsurgent group in the area against the communists. Of course, violence escalated between these two groups due to assassination of community members, and the FARC-EP formed in 1964, and the national government decided to legalize self-defense groups, militias, to battle against this increasing presence of guerrilla groups. And this organization was enforced by the army that use community action boards that are supposed to be civilian and armed groups that are quite important in Colombian rural areas. But at this time, in this area of Ataco, Rio Blanco, and Chaparral, these boards were rather weak. And in the case of the Paez community, the conflict with the what happened is that the conflict with the liberals forced communist peasants to settle in the rural area of Planadas. This means that they moved from Rio Blanco farther to the south, neighboring the indigenous territory, and they actually were collaborating with the communist peasants, the Paez community. However, one of the leaders of the communist group was assassinated and the group rearmed, and the Paez community refused to join the insurgency, and actually some of its members started to collaborate with the army. The rearmed communist group took away farms from the Paez, this is the Riota, and they relegated the community to the western margin of the river, and this fueled discontent against the guerrilla. And the army started, and also local politicians recommended the Paez to form a counterinsurgent group with their support. Of course, what happened again, we have this phenomenon of targeting of community members, and the military power of the self-defense group within the community prevailed. That meant that other civilian and armed organizations within the community were happy, and the community decided to engage in violent contention. However, in the mid-1980s, I don't know if you can hear me properly. Yeah, okay. In the mid-1980s, the Paez adopted the legal political organization typical of the indigenous communities in Colombia, and this meant that the Paez had to disarm the indigenous guard, because these usually are an section of the community, and this is the only documented case in Colombia in which an indigenous guard was armed. And also the state formalized the indigenous reserve at the beginning of the 1990s, and this opened the possibility for the Paez community to negotiate a peace accord in 1996 after the invigoration of armed institutions within the community. So what I'm doing now is to work on this framework, identifying the factors that account for the response of the communities in terms of engaging in violent contention. So what I found first is the legitimation of a violent response via grievances, mainly due to assassination of family and community members, and also due to land-related conflicts. This allowed the activation of social networks, which are quite important for recruitments, not only in the case of these kinds of militias. And also recruitments were facilitated because of participation in self-defense groups during the period of the violence in the 1950s. And this participation in organized violence allowed the community to have military training and also to create a military elite within the community, and also access to weapons. And finally, with conflict resolution institutions, this means that organizations for conflict resolution are illegitimate and ineffective, and in these cases, military leaders within the community and outside the community can co-opt community organizations because members cannot discuss alternatives to deal with the threat posed by rebels, and channels to negotiate with rebels are unavailable. This is important because in the case of a strong community, conflict resolution institutions, what has been found is that the communities prefer to engage in pacific contention against rebels. And this is true as long as we have the external support provided by the military, but also by political elites. And in this period, importantly, these civilian self-defense groups were legal. So this also incentivized the communities to engage in this kind of response. So with this, I would like to close. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angela, for this talk. We then move on to our fourth talk of today's session by Esther Ikenya. She earned her master in law with a specialty on human rights at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. She received a Master of Laws from the Nigerian Law School and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Benin. Her research interest is mainly on topics in the human rights perspective, and of course, in this complex interplay between national and international perspectives. She worked in many roles as a practitioner in the United Nations Office for Monitoring and all these kind of things. So we're looking forward for a quite interesting presentation. The title of the presentation is Rethinking Abortion Access from Women in Conflict and Post-Conflict Situations in Nigeria, a Human Rights Perspective. Esther, feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that brilliant introduction. And thank you to the organizers and everyone else for having me. It's nice to be here. So basically, my research focused on the situation of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations in Nigeria, particularly focusing on women and girls impacted by the farmer-herder clashes, as well as the Boko Haram crisis in the Northeast and Middle Belt regions of Nigeria. So basically, the background is conflict in Nigeria has been raging since 2009. That's in relation to the Boko Haram crisis. But in recent years, you find that the farmer-herder clashes have also come up, and now we're having issues of banditry. And then in these situations, women and girls, because of their status, they're basically subjected to a lot of harmful and discriminatory practices which run contrary to their human rights, which run contrary to international, regional, and of course, domestic human rights provisions, which are obtainable in Nigeria. Now, whereas in recent years, there have been improvements like in state responses across the globe in relation to issues of conflict, you find that in Nigeria, the situation of women and girls in conflict situations are largely remain deplorable. And this is despite the ratification of various international and regional human rights instruments in this regard. Whilst the ratification of these instruments sort of signify or indicate positive capacity and willingness by the government to ensure the protection of the rights of women and girls in conflict situations. However, you find that issues of access to abortion in conflict and post-conflict situations remain problematic in Nigeria due to the restrictive nature of the criminal penal provisions on abortion. And these issues which women are exposed to because of the restrictive laws are also further complicated due to the questions around the holistic adoption and implementation of human rights instruments, where government indicates capacity to ensure protection of rights by municipal law, but then because of cultural, religious, and other issues, you find that some of these rights, which have been recognized, excluded at national level. So you find that although we have consensus on paper in terms of the domestication, ratification of international human rights instruments, because of the exclusion, you find issues of implementation become a problem, especially in conflict settings. Now, if the government were to take like positive action, improved positive action in this regard, that as far as the laws are concerned, you find that it would actually help to positively impact the lives of women and girls who are impacted by the crisis going on currently in the northeastern region of Nigeria, the northwestern region, as well as the middle belt regions. So basically in my research, I looked at the laws which the government of Nigeria has domesticated, the laws which have been ratified by both at international level, of course, at the African regional level and domestic local level. I looked at these laws, and then some of the laws I looked at the international level, which center around the reproductive rights of women and girls in conflict situations and post-conflict situations in terms of their reproductive health and rights issues, include the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Geneva Convention of 1949, the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention, that's protocols 1 and 2, the ICESR, that's the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and of course, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, at regional level within Africa, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which has been ratified and domesticated by the Nigerian government. We have the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women, and popularly known as the Maputo Protocol. We also have the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons, known as the Kampala Convention on IDPs. We have various domestic laws in Nigeria. We have policies, and of course, the various states also have state laws which also apply to ensure protection of the rights of women and girls. Whilst these are all beautiful legal provisions, you now find that women and girls who are impacted, especially victims of sexual violence during conflict, continue to suffer when they suffer sexual violence in conflict and fall pregnant. You find that because of the restrictive nature of our abortion laws in Nigeria, as contained under both the criminal and penal codes, which obtain in the South and the North respectively, these laws actually criminalize abortion and only permit abortion to save the life of a woman. So because of these laws, you find that women and girls in conflict situations are not really provided the necessary services and support, because the law has failed to take into consideration their situation in conflict situations and of course in post-conflict situations. So this situation has negative consequences, both reproductive health consequences around exploring unsafe abortion methods for women and girls. Of course, they also ordinarily have a right to autonomy in decision-making on what they'll do with their bodies, but of course they don't have these opportunities because of the restrictive laws and the situation they find themselves during conflict. You also have the negative mental health consequences, where women and girls are forced to carry those pregnancies from raped by insurgents to term and have those babies. There are social consequences, of course, because most times you find because they have been raped by Boko Haram insurgents, they're rejected by their communities. Sometimes they're ashamed, and of course, they become withdrawn. Some of their family members also reject them because of their situation. So the urgent action which my research looked at was the need for the Nigerian government to consider broadening the exception. In Nigeria currently, of course, there's no right to the abortion or subsumed under the right to health. So because of this, you find women are suffering. So whilst that is still a gray area, like a lot of research has gone in there, a lot of studies, but the government is still not indicating commitment. However, in my research, I'm saying that the government should consider broadening the exception under the criminal code, which restricts abortion services to save the health or life of a woman, to also include women and girls who fall pregnant in conflict and post-conflict situations. Now, in my research, I also looked at the several considerations which are necessary for broadening the exception under the criminal and penal codes to permit abortion for women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations. There are human rights like considerations around the right to health. Women and girls have the right to health, and of course, the right to abortion can be subsumed under the right to health. Where the government takes positive steps in this regard, is going to the health of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations will be protected in accordance with the provisions under international and regional human rights laws. Of course, we have international humanitarian law. The argument there, amongst the considerations under international humanitarian law, you find that soldiers who are wounded during conflict have access to services, to healthcare services as a matter of urgency. So also considered having access to abortion services for women and girls who have been raped, early exposure prophylaxis and abortion services for women and girls who have been raped in conflict settings should also be considered alongside the needs of soldiers as matters of urgency. And then in terms of the sustainable development goals, we looked at the goals around goals 3 and goals 5 of the SDGs, looking at how both intersect and how positive action by the government would help to promote the rights of women around gender equality, the right to health, and reduce maternal mortality and morbidity, which are factors which increase when these situations rage. And of course, where it takes positive action to ensure that the rights of women and girls around access to abortion services are protected in conflict settings, we're also going to have strengthened health systems. The World Health Organization has, over the years, monitor the health systems in various countries and conducted multiple indicator cluster surveys. But you find that although in Nigeria, the situation was really poor at a time, the improved responses by the government saw the performance in 2017 rise, and again that it's also going to improve further if the government takes positive action to ensure protection of the health and rights of women and girls who are also plagued by conflict in Nigeria, which is sort of widespread. And then I made several recommendations at the conclusion of my study, requesting that the government reconsider its position on abortion to include women and girls in conflict situation, as well as ensure the review of extant laws which are tenable on issues of abortion under the criminal and penal codes in Nigeria. I also recommended that government authorities must move beyond ratification to the domestication of human rights laws and treaties in Nigeria, because unlike other countries where you have like a monist legal system, where these human rights treaties, once they are ratified, they become obtainable, obtainable in the various countries. Nigeria has a dualist legal system. So in addition to ratifying these international human rights treaties, they must also pass through the process of domestication by the National Assembly, like the legislature in Nigeria, before they can actually become laws in Nigeria. And then the government must ensure implementation of human rights provisions and recommendations. Various human rights treaty bodies have made recommendations over the years, especially around issues of conflict and the situation of women and girls in conflict situations. But you find that although the government always promises to take positive action in this regard, issues of culture, religion, and other factors continue to impact women and girls' rights negatively. And of course, I also recommended that abortion access should be guaranteed in all medical response protocols in conflict and post-conflict situations in Nigeria, as well as in other jurisdictions with similar challenges. The World Health Organization has a guideline. At the time this study was conducted, the World Health Organization's guideline, which doesn't allow provision of abortion services in countries where the laws do not permit such services to be provided, was a factor that was considered that actually negatively impacts the rights of like women and girls. So I recommended that if the government recognizes that this need for abortion services for victims of rape and other sexual violence issues are addressed, that it's also going to help to ensure protection of the rights of women and girls if it's expressly stated in the law and there's no gray area or confusion for humanitarian responders. So basically, that's what I looked at. I have a whole list of the sources that have been used for my work, for my research. They are not included here, but on request, they will be provided. I'm grateful to everyone who made this study possible, who supported, and of course to Lebanese University at Hanover, the center, and of course Volkswagen. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share my research with a wider audience. Thank you, Matthias, for your time, and thanks to my wonderful panelists. Super grateful for this opportunity. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Esther, for this wonderful talk. It was really interesting. We have now time to go to the questions from the audience, and I would suggest I kind of summarize the questions for each participant. So I will start with fungi, and the questions here are various questions. The first is kind of very actual one. What is the influence of the pandemic on domestic violence? Because there is a kind of increase, or one can often assume, or sometimes is assumed, that there is an increase of violence in these times, and how do the organization deal with that? Quite interesting is as well that you might expand a little bit on how the faith-based organizations deal with religious differences in the country. For example, the ambivalences or different approaches to partly violence against women, for example, in the Quran or the Bible, but maybe you can give a few remarks on the general religious landscape and how it is reflected in this different religious program. Then another question was on the skill training as means of making women self-reliant, and there's just the question if you think, or if you rank it as very successful, or if it really works in these different institutions you did research on. Okay, maybe you can just start to answer it.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so let me start with the one on the influence of the pandemic on domestic violence. Yes, indeed, domestic violence kind of increased during the pandemic, especially the heat of the pandemic, because of the lockdown restrictions and all the sorts of things that was happening. So the intensity of violence against women kind of increased during the heat of the pandemic. And these faith-based organizations, they were actually helping and assisting, because the women could call in, and they also have the relations with the police, even during the level 5 lockdown, where people could not move around. They had a relationship with the police, and they could actually go and collect the women who have called in, who want support to come to the shelter. Then the second one on the religious relations. So basically the South African or the Cape Townian landscape is based with cordial relations, like interfaith relations. They're generally cordial because of the setup, because both Muslims and Christians, they live in the same societies. So their relations are generally cordial. That's why you see, even at a Muslim shelter, Christians could come, even Christian religious leaders could come and deliver religious services. And although this organization, for example, Ihata Shelter, was a Muslim organization, it was not exclusively for Muslim, but it was open for other religions. And the example that I've provided of the other organization, SAFI, South African Faith and Family Institute, it actually tries to bring in this interfaith relations, that people from different religions, they try to come together. The religious leaders from diverse religions, they try to come together and they also come together with their communities. So generally, I can say the interfaith relations, they are cordial. There isn't conflict among religions on a general level. Then on the skills, from my follow-up interviews, the skills were generally helpful, or I can say they were generally successful, because when I had follow-up interviews with the beneficiaries, that is the women that were in the shelters, they were saying they were now working, they were now running their own beading businesses, and the other one was now running the candle making business. So generally, I can say it was kind of successful. And for some of the, two of my participants who were at St. Anne's Homes, they were now working as home-based care workers. So that's all.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Catherine. Maybe you can kind of expand a little bit on the specificality for or if there are special programs for male victims. Maybe you can kind of elaborate a little bit on the specificality of these programs and how do they look like. And the other questions are, I think, more towards the social background. On the one hand, do you have any information how the families of the victims deals with that, and what are the reactions there? And the second kind of background is more on the power relations, how they are, different power relations maybe between the men in the military are related to these kind of sexually based violence. And in general, there was a question if there are efforts for prevention for such form of sexual violence for men, and maybe as well, and then for women, if there are educational programs or things like that. Would be interesting to hear about that. And look, that's related to the aspect. There's a question down there on general on the implementing or the role of social status and how this is related to the frequency. I've already hinted to that. And a general question is are there any interventions in regard to general gender roles and kind of are there interventions to deal with this gender roles and maybe to change them? Okay, so this was now a whole bunch of questions. Feel free to answer, Catherine.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for those questions, Matthias. In regards to special programs for men who have been sexually victimized, the debate that has been going on is they've been non-existent, and at the moment there's been what is called gender inclusiveness, where men who have been sexually victimized are included in within the interventions that are offered to women. But that has been problematic because most of these interventions that are specifically for women are tailored for women. So in relation to the gender specifics, the difference between men and women, there is a need to seek for best strategies on how to respond to men. And that is kind of where we are at the moment, where we're trying to figure out which services do men consider appropriate. Let's say, for example, when we look at, say, prevention of pregnancy, when a woman is raped, that is the first immediate response, but men don't get pregnant, so we can't offer that kind of service. Whereas when you're considering services like, say, HIV, that can be considered, but in which context, and it relates to which forms of sexual victimization they've experienced. So there's no specific, like, say, tailored men-centered special programs. But what was revealed in the interview from the interviewers, who these are humanitarian organization representatives that work with organizations within the conflict zones. Some of the services that men would need are the services that cater for the psychological effect of it. So we're looking at mental health services. In regards to the families of the victims, most as this wasn't my research, but from the literature review, men usually are banished from their community, or their families expel them from their family. So they kind of disconnect, because it is not fathomed that men can be sexually violated or victimized. So there's a lack of knowledge and understanding in that regard. So at the moment, the reaction is it is impossible for a man to be sexually victimized, and they're rendered weak in that regard. The next question, I categorized it under perpetrators. This is within the conflict zone. So who exactly commits sexual violence against men? It is both men and women, but these are soldiers against the civilian men and women. So it is not unheard of that women will not commit sexual violence against men. Say, for example, forcing them into sexual intercourse, or raping them using objects like rifles or bottle cuts, or things in that way. And then with regards to awareness, with regards to intervention and awareness, the programs and intervention services that are tailored to women are specific, and they are existing. But to be able to include men in those services, that is where my research detaches, because men and women are different, and they're if say, for example, a woman who's been raped will not need. I'm not saying they will not need, but the immediate service would be catering for, say, pregnancy and HIV, whereas for a man, is battling in his mind with the society view of masculinity, and how his wife is going to look at him, or how his children are going to look at him. So, for example, if he was forced to watch, say, one of his family members who is a male rape his wife, how to deal with that. So for men, it's not the services that are immediately needed are mental health services, as opposed to the services that are women are needed. But this has not been mandated specific response for men. So that is kind of where we are at the moment, seeking out the best responses for men who have been sexually victimized. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You covered it all. So we move on to Angela. There's as well the gender question. Is there a kind of gender base in the violence, or was it observed there in Colombia? And on the other hand, did gender plays some role, or which role in the peace building process there? Speaking of that, there is as well a question on the relation between the militia groups and peaceful acting organizations. Were there any relations between them, and how do they react to each other? And then we have another question on were there any measures taken to demobilize the militia or something like that? And I think this is, again, the things here summarized on the list. Feel free to answer, Angela.
Thank you, Matthias. Well, regarding the gender dimension, that's not my specialty, but what I've seen in the cases is that women did not engage in this kind of violent response, either in Ataco, Rio Blanco, and Chaparral, or in the case of the indigenous community. What started to happen in the indigenous community is when the civilian and unarmed organizations started to gain power, the women found a space to voice out their concerns regarding this violent contention, because they were somehow justifying that they needed another kind of response against the FARC-EP, basically because they were killing their children. So women in these cases acted more like against this kind of violent response. In the case of the Paez community, the community itself was responsible of the process of demobilizing the militia, and this was possible with the peace accord with the FARC-EP. This is a unique peace accord in the context of Colombia, in which a community signed a peace accord, and this was with the support of other organizations, the Red Cross, for instance, the Catholic Church in Colombia. And then we have this smooth transition between violent contention and pacific contention, because still the indigenous community refused to the guerrilla to have any kind of power within their territory. But in the case of Ataco, Rio Blanco, and Chaparral, what happened is that the FARC-EP actually defeated the counterinsurgent group, the peasant-based counterinsurgent group. And what happened is that another countrywide organization known as self-defense groups in Colombia somehow co-opted this group, and they started to act as another organization known in Colombia as the Bloc Tolima. So in this case, the demobilization was not possible until 2007, when the national government started peace talks with these paramilitary militias that were acting against left-wing guerrilla groups, and they were somehow acting in connivance with the military as well. Yeah, this for the case of the demobilization. That was the last question. And also regarding gender, I had the opportunity also to do some research regarding the peaceful and the peace initiative in the area. And again, what I have found is the important role of women. Women are very engaged in producer organizations that are strengthening the social capital in this area, and that are helping to overcome the negative effects of the war. In this case, in this particular case of Southern Tolima, after the mobilization of the FARC-EP in 2017, they have the opportunity to somehow to rebuild the communities, because they don't have reactivation of war, what is happening in other areas in Colombia. They were somehow prevented from this because they don't have illegal crops or anything like that. They have basically a coffee-based economy. So, and in these cases, the role of the women, what I have seen is that has been really, really important in promoting these community organizations.
Yeah, thank you. Then we move on to the questions for Esther. First of all, there is the question if there are any social movements demanding more liberal abortion rules, and on the other hand, how looks it like in the local or regional civil society organizations? Are there organizations which provide medical or any psychosocial help there? Or is there still stigmatization and rejection? Then kind of general question on the problem of dualist legal system and monist legal system, that you have the kind of this is obviously not only a problem in your case, in your research case, there's in every country. Do they discuss the differences between regional or international legal norms and the norms in Nigeria, or do they kind of ignore the problem simply and kind of proceed in their way as they adapted the laws in Nigeria themselves? And the last question is on the method. You kind of use the method as a legal scholar, and maybe it would be worthwhile to take an interview approach, to interview the people there and what they are, the women, and get some other insights in the impact of the legal rules you observed.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. So first of all, for the first question, since 2012, women's rights organizations have been trying to get the government to pass a law. Of course, they have to be smart around these movements. They don't go asking for the adoption of a law on abortion, but they ask for the adoption of a national reproductive health law, which of course would guarantee access to abortion for women. And that whole movement has been going on for a while. They've gone before the national legislature, and of course the bill that was brought before the legislature was thrown out. And since then, of course, movements have continued trying to see how we can make progress in this regard across various organizations. And beyond that, this other arm of the question for number one, could you please clarify?
Sorry for that. The question one was on are there social movements demanding more liberal abortion rules, and in general the regional, but I think you answered a little bit on that, regional civil society organizations, and if they are provided medical and psychosocial support.
Okay, yes. So in terms of medical and psychosocial support, there are various organizations which actually provide like psychosocial support, but of course, most times they depend on funding from donor organizations. Local organizations which provide psychosocial support, their work is usually limited by the amount of funding they have access to be able to assess these regions which are bedeviled by conflict situation, as well as in post-conflict settings in Nigeria. And then on the issue of the dualist legal system in Nigeria, you find that Nigeria was like colonized by the United Kingdom. And when Nigeria gained independence in 1960, of course, we had various laws. We have various laws in Nigeria which are applicable. We have received English laws. We also have domestic legislation. But of course, we have a legislative system in Nigeria where the legislature is bicameral. We don't have like a unitary government system. We have a federal system of government. So in terms of the domestication and adoption of international treaties, policies, norms, even where you have Nigerian officials, government officials attend international conferences and accede to these treaties, when they sign those documents, Unlike some other countries where once those documents are ratified, it automatically becomes law in the local context in their countries. That's not the same in Nigeria. When such laws are ratified, of course, it also has to pass through the domestication by the national legislature. It has to go through the first, second, and third reading phase. And then if they accept it on the floor of the House, it becomes law in Nigeria. So yeah, that has a lot to do, because when laws are brought before the House, for example, the National Reproductive Health Bill that I spoke about, which would have guaranteed access to abortion for women, amongst other provisions, when it came before the floor of the House, of course, Nigeria is a largely religious, cultural society. You have so many ethnic groups with varying cultures and beliefs. So when these laws are brought before them, you have lawmakers who do not agree with some of the provisions of the treaties that have been brought before them. So of course, when they disagree on the provisions and feel some parts should apply and others shouldn't apply, it becomes a problem. And then even though the right to health is guaranteed under the Constitution, as well as several other rights, you find that as much as these rights are there, the same government craftily in the same Constitution in Section C, subsection 6, C, paragraph C of the Constitution renders them non-justiciable. So as much as you have a problem with the issues you're having, you can't actually take them to courts within the local context, except of course you're assessing like the African regional courts to get justice for whatever challenge you have. I hope I answered question 2 accurately. And then for the third question on the method of my research, okay, the time frame for my research, yes, I was, at the time the research was conducted, I was a national volunteer under the UNV program with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But my research was restricted by the Center for Human Rights Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria, due to the time frame. It was a short time frame, so I had to conduct desk research. Although even when conducting desk research, some interviews had been conducted by other scholars. So I availed myself of the documents by scholars, various works that had been written, and interviews that had been conducted by humanitarian organizations, by people conducting studies with the women impacted by the conflict. And of course, the whole idea of my research, it was inspired by my work at the time, working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I had met I had been opportune to meet like an IDP who was underage and was pregnant because she was raped during conflict. And of course, she had to carry the baby like to term and suffered serious health complications. So that kind of inspired my research in this area, trying to see how we can get the government through policy to improve in this regard. So basically that's that. I hope I answered your question sufficiently, Matthias.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, so after we got a round of questions from the audience, I would ask the panelists, do you have any questions to or comments to each other you want to ask the other presenters?
Catherine, Fungi, and Angela, I really enjoyed your presentations. Of course, you're all doctoral students, and I'm a master's student who graduated. So I was really, really inspired by your works. And Angela, I really liked the way you set out your presentation. It was really, really, really nice. I can't really speak much to your research because of the, of course, diverse fields. And my work is basically mostly human rights focused, but I think you did very well in your various areas. So well done. Keep up the good work. And thank you, Matthias, once again, for moderating the session excellently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no other comments from the panelists, I have a question for you, because the our workshop is, or generally speaking, the panel at least, is on different facets of violence, so the different role and the different appearances of violence and different social processes. And for me, it would be very interesting to hear from you. How you consider this type of violence? Is it in all times totally kind of destroying social relations? Is it kind of totally anti-social, which is in many cases surely true, especially when it comes to different forms of bodily hurting bodies or sexual violence and all these kind of things. But on the other hand, do you find any kind of productive or kind of not really positive, but an output where you'd say, okay, here violence was at least, if not appropriate, but a means to kind of get a regulation for a conflict, to deal with that. So it would be very interesting if you kind of expand a little bit of what kind of violence your research was about and how was this role of violence, very generally speaking.
Okay. So in my case, the kind of violence I was talking about is violence against women. So this includes sexual violence, physical violence, emotional, psychological, and economic violence. But mostly what I realized is in terms of the domestic violence that I was focusing on, it was mainly physical violence between intimate partners. And it indeed disrupted social relations because in most cases, some of these forms of violence ended up leading to cases of divorce and disruptions in families where the children had to go to the grandmothers or the mother is now staying in the shelter, and eventually it leads to divorce. So in a way, I could say this form of violence that I was researching on kind of disrupted social relations and family relations.
For my research, I'm speaking in regards to conflict-related sexual violence, which is basically targeting men. But this is very different from the victimization of men outside of a conflict zone. So you will not find the same forms of violence within a conflict zone against men occurring outside a conflict zone. So my research is speaking specifically on sexual violence, and the perpetrators mostly are looking at humiliating not just the individual they are targeting, but also it can be in relation to humiliating the entire community. Like, say, for example, if the perpetrators go into a region where men are considered the leaders of that particular community, so they will violate the men in order to downgrade the men within that particular community. So they are not only targeting those men, but they're also targeting the role of men within that particular community. So it is not specifically the same agendas as in relation to victimization against women, but then it's the same thought as far as power dynamics is concerned, because you're looking at downgrading men in particular in that particular society and maybe in a tribe or etc. So mine was specifically on sexual victimization, but in a way targeting the humiliation of men in general in that particular community. Yeah.
Well, in my case, it was about physical violence, but collective violence. I mean, how groups organize to exert violence collectively. And you are a sociologist, Matthias, you know that conflict has social functions. So in this case, trust within the community increased in certain point at certain point in time, you know, but and of course, as a collective action effort, it requires community members to become like real close to each other, and this activated social networks as well. So in this case, we have a very special type of violence that requires trust, that requires a strong social relationship between or among the members of the community. Still, from my personal perspective, I won't recommend civilian engagement in this kind of violent contention, because their targeting of civilians is going to increase, but still it exceeds certain functions within the community that were important in order to organize this collective violence against the rebels.
Okay. In my case, my research basically centered on conflict-related sexual violence targeting women and girls across the Northeast and the Middle Belt region of Nigeria. In the Northeastern region of Nigeria, you basically have the Boko Haram conflict, which has been raging since 2009. And in recent years, we have the farmer-header clashes, which have come up. And of course, women and girls are usually targeted as victims of violence in this conflict. So my research focused on the impact of the conflict for victims of sexual violence who fall pregnant and then are unable to access abortion services and have to deal with the negative health consequences, as well as the social and psychological consequences. Then in terms of social relationships, definitely individual social relationships are affected by the conflict. You find in cases where women or girls have been raped by these insurgents, or they are abducted and made Boko Haram wives, you find that there's this level of distrust when they're rescued from the Boko Haram terrorists. There's this level of distrust more often than not in their local communities. People do not trust them because they feel maybe they are loyal to their Boko Haram husbands, in quotes, even though they were abducted against their will. So sometimes you find that their families have to move them away from their local environments after they've been rescued to other places where people do not know them and do not know what they've been exposed to, so that they can continue living their lives without any form of stigmatization or discrimination, which they usually suffer. And then in terms of the larger society, of course, these Boko Haram terrorists sometimes are members of families, people who they've known in local communities growing up, who become terrorists. And of course, there's a level of distrust that comes up between the family of non-terrorists and those who they identify, whose children have become terrorists. And of course, social interactions are impacted as well, because people can no longer meet together, because there have been many reported cases of people, even farmers are killed. Sometimes, even most recently, farmers were killed by Boko Haram terrorists. A Boko Haram faction attacked some farmers, rounding them almost amounting to 40 or more in the last month, and murdered them in the Northeast. So you find that, social interactions, they are no longer able to meet socially like they used to, because large gatherings might attract these terrorists sometimes, who come to exercise power and, of course, kill them and abduct those they want to abduct from local communities. So the conflict has affected social interactions to a large extent in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you. This kind of, I think you answered quite illuminating on the phenomenon, because you catch the different facets of the individual, collective violence, and what's the kind of meaning structure when people perceive these different acts of violence, and how they deal with that, and how they react to that, which leads to the next point I'm interested in, and this comes back to the beginning of the of our panel, where I talked about the relation between citizenship and violence, and that these different kinds of violence might be related, or this would be the question for you. Is there, or do you see a change in the social construction of citizenship? What is a good citizen? What is kind of considered as appropriate behavior for a citizen? And what are the different aspects of social inequality in respect to citizenship? Do you see a change in, for example, gender relations as a normative aspect of the general citizenship model? But as well, we have this as well connected to violence, the social status of a person and how it is related. So do you see some changes because of these violent acts and behaviors, regardless of if it's more individual or collective, in the picture what is considered important to be a good citizen in, at least in this nation state, but as well kind of in respect to the globe as well, because citizenship can be as well global citizenship, but something that you want to take part, at least in the political process of a community. So do you see these changes, or are these mainly reactions which point to the fact, no, we just want to be disturbed in our traditional ideas about citizenship by this act of violence, and kind of put them out of the discourse?
Okay, so maybe to respond to that, talking from a religious perspective and looking at who is a good citizen, they kind of look at the issue of violence against women as a moral issue. So they took it as a moral issue. So religious leaders now, when they try to teach and to educate the societies, they'll then look at it from a moral perspective. Because when you look at these issues of violence against women, it is morally perpetrated because unequal power relations within religions. So how men or how people within religions abuse the power is what causes the violence. So then to address these issues of violence, the religious leaders is to teach and to sensitize how this is a moral issue. So when you're being violent, from a religious perspective, it is morally wrong. So for example, in Islam, they would say it's morally wrong and you're sinning against Allah. And in Christianity, likewise, they would say if you are perpetrating violence to your woman or to your wife or to your children, it's morally wrong against God. So looking at those issues, it becomes a moral issue and not that just a legal issue. That's why I had to address this from a religious perspective, because it ceases to be a legal issue, but a moral issue.
Well, on my end, as far as conflict-related sexual violence against men is concerned, I approach the atrocities from a humanitarian perspective, and that is the humanitarian perspective is to alleviate suffering from those that have been affected by any form of violence. So in society, men would not be considered as needing that any service. Well, previously, because it wasn't really a mandate to look at men and alleviate any form of services because of their masculinity roles, and as far as society views men in specific cultures, and as far as heightening the status of women within society. So all that affects looking at men as victims, and also men within the men themselves, because some of them would not take it as being sexually violated, and that is one of the reasons they would not come out to reveal these atrocities that have happened to them, because they themselves don't think they are violated. So for mine, it's more of alleviating suffering amongst this group of victims.
Well, in my case, unfortunately in Colombia, violent response are both legitimate and legal. So at the beginning of the process of formation of these groups, what we have is a government authorizing local communities to exert this kind of response against rebels. Even though later on we have a ban on these groups, or I mean, on civilian groups defending themselves, what we have here is the perception that violence is a proper response against rebels, and this happened like across the whole time frame, even nowadays. But what I have seen recently in Colombia is that somehow local communities are like implementing more pacific responses. So somehow this is like delegitimizing violence, but I will say that it will take a long time to separate violent responses in terms of legality and legitimization. So unfortunately, a good citizen, especially in the period that I analyzed, was the one that was able to engage in this kind of responses against rebels, not only because it was legitimized, but also because it was legal and it was authorized, and it was what the government wanted the civilians to do.
So, Esther, you still there?
Oh, sorry, I had glitches with my network. So in Nigeria, the fact that terrorists and prescribed armed groups, as they are referred to, engage in these issues of violence doesn't make them lose their legitimacy as citizens of the country, although you now talk about the criminal aspect of their actions. Of course, they label them terrorists, and the criminal justice system is applicable, but they do not lose their citizenship on account of their actions as terrorists, because sometimes you find that over the years, the Boko Haram group, some factions say Western education is seen. Some of them, they have these ideologies around religion, which other people which come up. Of course, in terms of citizenship, yeah, in wider society, you consider them criminal elements, you consider them terrorists for engaging in these issues. They're considered bad people, basically, but they're still Nigerian citizens. So most times you find that where government security agents round them up and they're arrested, when they get them, they usually reintegrate them into society where they renounce or repent of their actions. Where they repent of their actions, they are reintegrated into society. You find that they have programs aimed at rehabilitating them and bringing them back into the general society. Even though, of course, you find people upset, especially people who have suffered the consequences of their actions. Maybe they've lost family members, they've lost livelihoods, they've had to relocate. And they feel bad because they feel that the government response and the opportunities provided for these people are more than what the victims of the conflict are actually availed of. But it doesn't really change any other thing as far as their citizenship is concerned.
Yeah, thank you. This was kind of intriguing set of answers to the problem, because I think you kind of hinted exactly to the 3 points which surely should be made when we talk about the problem of violence and violence and conflict and the relation to citizenship. There is on the one hand the kind of general moral attitudes, worldviews towards the problem, where people kind of evaluate certain action, where in many times, at least in this worldview, violence is something which might be not allowed. Nevertheless, and this is the second point, there is a problem of practices. There's how people act in everyday life and how they are used to act in the different situations. And if you are living in a social figuration where a kind of violence is a kind of means people are used to when they are kind of want to reach a certain aim and something like that, then it's kind of difficult to get rid of violence or something like that, because it's inbuilt in the whole thing. And which I think, and this is the third point, strikes me the most when it comes to these different comparisons between, especially in your case, in different cases, is the distinct patterns of legitimization. You all four did a very good job in kind of picking to the different arguments why people think something happens like that, what might be a good reason or a bad reason for that, or as well what they kind of imagine what the consequences for this action. So I'm always kind of surprised how kind of complex able are people to evaluate these different aspects of their action. And it is a very complex historical situation where these different things are implemented, and because they are kind of developed in this historical situations, it's kind of very difficult to change them. There is a kind of internal stabilization of these legitimization for the drawn for moralities and used for certain practices. Okay, so I think this was a kind of very intriguing, wonderful, interesting panel. It was exactly that what I imagined when we talked years ago, because it was long term until we were able to really then implement these the conference and all, kind of exactly what we were talking about by thinking about this panel. And you were able to kind of show the different really what the title meant, the different facets of violence, and how violence might be or surely an important category when we want to analyze or categorize different social actions, but it only kind of makes sense from a scholarly point of view if you kind of see how violence is embedded in the different social contexts. And you were very kind of very clever in looking at these different contexts and these different aspects, how violence is generated and how is especially related to conflict situations or post-conflict situations. So from my perspective, I want to thank you all for your presentations and for your contributions. I want to thank the audience for their questions, and of course, for those who didn't ask the questions, for their willingness at least to listen to us and watch us discussing these questions. And hopefully we kind of stay in touch for the further steps for the conference, because if you know, if you have already mentioned it, that I've already mentioned at the beginning, there will be another part for the conference in end of January. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye to the presenters, bye-bye to the audience, and see you somewhere and have fun. Bye-bye.